morning. I'm Andrew Craig. I'm a reporter, attorney, and author, and member of the press club here. I work for the Justice Integrity Project, which is a reporting organization and one of the co-sponsors of this event. Thank you all for coming. I think you're going to see an exceptional slice of history as our speaker, Dr. William Pepper, describes both his filing to the Organization of American States Human Rights Organization yesterday on behalf of his client, Sirhan Sirhan, the convicted killer of the late U.S. Senator Robert Kennedy. I've got the filing here that was put to the IACHR, which is the human rights body of the Organization of American States, and this will be available electronically to all of you and those watching in various film methods. Before presenting our speaker, who's, as you likely know, a famed attorney, a best-selling author, an eminent human rights advocate who's taught that topic at Oxford University for many years, I'd like to provide context to what I believe is an extraordinary presentation that you're about to hear. And we'll have, of course, a lot of time for questions. Last night, Dr. Pepper spoke here at the National Press Club about this case to a group called the McClendon Group, the Speaker Society. And I'll just paraphrase, and he can put it in his own words, but he said words to the effect that the Sirhan case is likely the greatest example of injustice that he's seen in a major case in his many decades of practicing law. He can put that in a more succinct and quotable way. But that, I think, helps portray the historical nature of what we're about to hear. And as further context, this room at the National Press Club is called the John Peter Zenger Room, named after, of course, the first famous U.S. journalist who operated nearly 300 years ago. It's also the case that this room may look familiar to those watching on video because it was just last month that friends of President Trump used this room for a major press conference used by his attorney, Mark Kasowitz. So here we are, and I think it's one or two other historical elements bringing this to contemporary times is that Dr. Pepper was a friend of both Martin Luther King and Senator Kennedy. And he was not just a friend who may have met them, autographed something or other, but he was sought out by both of them to work substantively on what they were trying to do in the 1960s. So he is a historical figure in his own right, even without this kind of case that we're talking about. And I'd like you all to think just for a second of the journey he's undertaken that's part of the context here, where he ends up, after years of very thorough research, defending the accused and convicted killers of his friends, these world leaders. This is not on some technical legal argument that lawyers, particularly in Washington, are infamous for. This is, and he's going to describe, he believes, and the evidence suggests, that they did not fire the shots. And here we are at the National Press Club. We thank all of you for appearing here. But this is a story that has not really been told. And I hope you'll question him about his reasons for thinking that. But what I've just said and what he's about to say is not known by the public. And we have and will have next year on the 50th anniversary of both of these killings, innumerable discussions about their legacy, their importance. Many books will come out. And here's just putting down a challenge to each of you listening to this. How many of those historical 50-year anniversary news reports, features, are going to give you even a small hint of what you're about to hear now? And my final point, because this is really his news conference, is why should we care? Why am I here? That's not that important, but the more important thing is why should you care? And the reason is we now have in these kind of cases, and by the way, he's written 3 books about the Martin Luther King case. This is Orders to Kill, his first. There's another, The Plot to Kill King, that came out last year, another very thick book with lots of depositions. This is proof. He was hired by the King family in the 1990s to find the real killer, and he won a jury verdict in 1999 in Memphis, the civil case, showing that the convicted killer, James Earl Ray, did not do it. And he did firsthand research to find who did it, confront those people, many of them still alive, and get the story that goes into these books, which are not reviewed by major newspapers. So here's the issue, and the last thing I'll say about this, about why we should care. We have evidence about 2 of the most important murders in United States history. And I'll say that this press conference is generating news in Europe and in Asia in the last few days. People care about this, but they only care if dots are connected. And here's the last dot to connect. If people can't write and report in a thorough way about evidence, eyewitness, medical, scientific, of what happened 50 years ago on some of our important world leaders, how are we possibly going to understand what's going on now when there are secret investigations going on that also affect world history? And so we've got to have this kind of context, historical, scientific, legal, eyewitness, to even attempt to understand today's news. And with that, Dr. Pepper.
Thank you, Andrew. So it's always difficult to follow Andrew and to really understand about whom he's introducing and what he's saying. Years ago, I had the same problem when I had to follow Bill Coffin, Reverend William Sloane Coffin, who I regarded as the most articulate American, and Bill and I went across the country on a tour to deal with anti-war issues, and Bill was extraordinarily articulate. The problem that we face with the media is enormous. The consolidation of control of the media at this point in time in American history, in my view, is virtually complete. We don't have a Bill Atwood anymore, who is running a mainstream media company like Look magazine, who wanted to do my work when I got back from Vietnam as a journalist. He wanted to do my work as a full magazine piece in Look. And Lyndon Johnson, I mentioned this last night because it's reflective of a change in media. Lyndon Johnson sent Admiral Harriman in to see him the week before we met. And Harriman said the president had a favor, and the favor was please don't ever publish anything that Bill Pepper writes. And Atwood said to me at the time, how do you think about that? You're not 30 years old and here the President of the United States is worried about you. I said, what'd you tell him? That's my main concern. He said, I told him we would publish if we believe what you were saying and give the President my best regards. We don't have that anymore. We don't have that. We have people who, if they dare to go forward and attempt to put out there books like the books on the King case, for review, they will be moved from book reviewing to being editors of obituary pages, which is what happened to a reviewer of the New York Times when he wanted to do a review on Orders to Kill in 1995, that long ago. Anyway, what Andrew said is correct. I came to know Martin, but I only knew Martin King the last year of his life. And that was as a result of my writings on Vietnam and the photographs I took and the stirring of his conscience, which made him actually weep when he saw it. And we worked together that last year, and we were very naive, both he and I and SCLC, his organization, about the danger that he was putting himself into when he decided to bring 500,000 people to Washington, to this capital, not to march, but to camp, and to besiege their legislators to put money back into social programs. That was never going to be allowed because there was a great fear on the part of the military that that group would get out of hand and it would have a revolution. And 100 cities burned that year, remember. And there was almost a revolution in France that André Malraux was able to maneuver against with de Gaulle and stop. So there was a legitimate fear that if Martin King came here, this would happen. Well, so they had to make sure he didn't leave Memphis. Bobby, I was Bobby Kennedy's Citizens Chairman in Westchester County, New York, when he ran for the Senate in the state of New York in 1964. I was only a kid, but I had a large reform following, and he needed that type of grassroots involvement, which he didn't have. And at that point in time, the Kennedy family was still very much into machine elitist politics. But the man they killed was not the man I knew. The man they killed 4 years later was a different man. He had been to West Virginia and Kentucky. He had seen shoeless children. He'd seen children who were malnourished, and he was determined to do something about that. He was a different human being, the one they killed. The one I knew in 1964, I didn't care for all that much. The one they killed, for me, amounted to a great loss. So, as it took me 10 years to make up my mind to represent James Earl Ray from 1978 to 1988, I had to be convinced. We knew he wasn't the shooter, but I had to be convinced that he didn't have a knowing involvement. That took 10 years of work on the streets of Memphis and elsewhere to convince me, and then I finally agreed to represent him. With respect to Sirhan, I came on this case in 2007, so it's a decade ago. And I did that, his lawyer, his first lawyer at the time, an ongoing lawyer, did everything he could to try to get a trial. Larry Teeter died. So Sirhan was without counsel. I was approached. I started to review the evidence and realized that it was so weak and so bad and so unjust that this is one I had to take on. The evidence against Sirhan and his guilt was weaker than any evidence they had against James Earl Ray in the King case. So I agreed to represent Sirhan. What has happened then in that case over the years is it's gone through the California system, the Supreme Court, and finally denied. Then it went into the Federal District Court of the United States. And when I came on, we took the attempt to get an evidentiary hearing or a trial for Mr. Sirhan from the Federal District Court through the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and then the Supreme Court of the United States. We not only were denied every step of the way, But we had every indication that there's no way that those judges could have ever reviewed this evidence. And I can discuss some of that with you. No way they could have reviewed it. They just simply were treating this with the back of their hands and denying denying an evidentiary hearing, remember. Not just a new trial, but an evidentiary hearing. So in 50 years, this man has been in prison without even an evidentiary hearing before a court of law that would attempt to show the evidence that had been used to convict him. He is 74 years old, and we have failed and exhausted all of our remedies here in the United States. Having done that, we have filed yesterday, as Andrew said, this very, very large petition with the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. Now, America is one of the OAS treaty nations and is subject to the jurisdiction, and this is probably the only jurisdiction that where you can sue the United States of America in international law. And but it is subject to the jurisdiction of the Inter-American Commission. We are asking the Inter-American Commission to take a serious look at this case and to give us, under their auspices, an evidentiary hearing or refer the case to the Inter-American Court for Human Rights, which is the next level up, and that's the court of the OAS. And it's tough and it's difficult, and because the remedies have been exhausted, we do qualify, and we have made a very powerful case. Now, what is that case? Why is this man innocent? Wasn't he at the Ambassador Hotel? And didn't he have a pistol? And didn't he fire that pistol? And the answer to those questions is all yes. But let's back up a bit. The attorney who represented him was a well-known criminal lawyer in Los Angeles called Grant Cooper. Now, Grant Cooper, at the time and throughout the trial of his client, Sirhan Sirhan, Grant Cooper was under a pending felony indictment. They were holding over his head an indictment throughout the trial. That was because somehow there appeared on his witness table minutes of a grand jury proceeding that he was attending, and of course it's illegal to have those minutes, and he had them. And he didn't know how he had them, but he had them, and they charged him and arrested him. Okay, so now that's the basis for legal defense, professional assistance to Sirhan. What did he do at the trial? He conducted no investigation. He accepted the state's ballistics findings entirely. He did not look at any other options. He started off by addressing the jury and saying, "We are not here to free a guilty man. Our client is guilty. We are here to help you understand that his life should be saved." So he tailored his whole approach to avoiding the death penalty for Sirhan and not trying the case. So he did not do anything on a positive note in terms of introducing ballistics evidence, introducing an autopsy report that Dr. Noguchi produced. The autopsy report itself clears Sirhan. But it was sent in weeks after the trial had begun. The state held it back for as long as they could. And then finally they sent it in. And he didn't even make a motion to receive that autopsy report because he really didn't want it. It didn't help the purpose of his masters. So Sirhan went through this kind of representation. He didn't question the ballistics. They didn't put Noguchi on the stand for the purpose of identifying the neck bullet to Sirhan's pistol, which could not be done. Years later, an ballistic examination showed they couldn't match that bullet, that neck bullet in Bob's corpse. They couldn't match that to Sirhan's gun. Now, what happened with Sirhan, what we did. We spent a lot of time with a man called Philip von Prague, who took a tape recording by a Canadian news journalist named Brzezinski. And he analyzed that tape recording with the highest form of technological expertise. And what he showed, and it's all in here, in his own words in detail, what that technological investigation of the firing, the sounds of the firing of the weapon showed was that 13 bullets were fired. Sirhan's gun had 8 bullets, 13 were fired. Some of the bullets came from one direction, west to east. The other, they were able to identify this. The other shots were coming from east to west. So there were clearly 2 shooters going on. Right. Most staggering evidence is that Bob Kennedy was hit with 3 bullets at powder burn range. Powder burn range in his back and behind his right ear. About an inch, that one from the right ear was fired about an inch away from his right ear. All at powder burn range, at a slightly upward angle, which meant that the shooter, the actual killer, was down below Bob and was putting the gun up against his back and firing into his body and then reaching up and putting the fatal bullet here behind the right ear. Every available witness indicates that Sirhan was never closer to Senator Kennedy than 5 or 6 feet in front of him, in front. Okay. Now, what did Sirhan do? What did he do? He got off 2 shots, 2 shots, and then his hand was pinned to a steam table and he pulled the trigger robotically without any control of the gun. So he only got off 2 shots. Now, what was he shooting for and why did he get off 2 shots? And isn't that incriminating? Well, what happened is he was taken control of by a handler, a woman in a polka dot dress, who led him into the pantry and stayed next to him. And at a critical time, gave him a slight pinch on the cheek, on the neck. When he had that, he jumped up and he faced the direction of the senator coming toward him, and he pulled a gun from his waistband, from his waist, and he aimed at what he saw were the same targets that he saw at the firing range that afternoon, human forms on a target, and he was doing target practice, which he was led to do. Now, how do we know this? I retained Dr. Daniel Brown, who's the world's leading expert on mind control and conditioning efforts. Dan, as a professor at Harvard, has spent most of his career on this subject. He spent 70 hours with Sirhan under hypnosis and on free recall. And what he came out with and what we learned was that Sirhan was missing for about 2 weeks. And during those 2 weeks, he was in a clinic. And at that clinic, where there was an operation to put him under hypnosis and use chemicals so that he would be controllable at the right point in time. And this is exactly what Dan believes happened, that when she brought him into that pantry room, when she gave him the cue after he had been at the rifle range that afternoon firing at those targets, that he was, in fact, under that type of control. Sirhan did not remember the specific details of the shooting itself and all of that, but what he did remember was meeting the woman and having coffee with her. He does remember having some alcoholic drinks beforehand, and he remembers her taking him into the pantry, but he doesn't remember the physical act. And as try as we could get, Dan could try to get him to recall that, he said it's too strong. Whatever they used in terms of the chemicals was too strong, and it blocked that. So what do we see then? We see a patsy who is there to distract everyone in the room. We have witnesses who have heard many shots. We have scientific evidence that show there were 13 shots. We know this is the absurdity. We know, it's undeniable that he only got off 2 shots before he lost control of the gun. And Bob was hit with 3, powder burn in the back. We know there are witnesses that saw 2 people, including this woman, leaving the ambassador premises and in glee shouting out, "We shot him, we shot him." All right, that type of nonsense. But the evidence just was so enormous in terms of the potential acquittal that his summation of his counsel makes no sense at all. No sense at all. When he comes before the jury at the end of the day and he makes a plea for them not to give him the death penalty, acknowledging that he's clearly guilty, he was badgered into saying that he did it because, as Cooper said, look, you had a gun, you were there, you shot. Everybody says you're guilty. You better admit it, maybe we can save your life. And this 24-year-old kid, that's really what he was. He was an immigrant from Palestine. He was a Palestinian, but he was a Christian Palestinian, and his family came into California, and he went to school there, but he worked at racetracks as a trainer, and particular tracks that were controlled by mafia interests. The manager of one of those tracks took a special interest in him and would shepherd him to the rifle range, and even took him to the clinic. They had him contacted by what he came to call, and Dan accepted, a man called the radio man, who would work with him on radio transmissions in terms of writings about Kennedy. So they did a good job in terms of setting this guy up, except the evidence fell down completely. So that leads us to believe there's no way that a judge, trial court judge, appellate judge, could read this actual, uncontested, incontrovertible evidence and say, this man has been unfairly convicted and should have at least an evidentiary hearing, so under oath, everything I'm telling you could be put out. Under oath, all the evidence that we have could be tested, could be challenged. That's all we've ever wanted to do. Yes, if we could get a new trial, wonderful. But I was not that keen on the possibility of that, so just give us an evidentiary hearing. They wouldn't do that. And it's particularly discouraging because the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, as many of you know, is supposedly the most progressive or the most liberal Court of Appeals in the United States. And they just turned them down and said, no further filings will be permitted in this case. They're closing the door once and for all on it. He's been in prison. There have been various attempts to intimidate him and lead him to become angry, where if we had tried to coach him as much as possible, where if he got involved in altercation, he could have been killed. So he's kept his hands at his sides. And he's also always reported to us what's happened, and we have filed formal complaints with respect to that. But we're really on our last legs. This man will die in prison. Will the Inter-American Commission hear this case? Will they take it? Will they ask the United States Attorney General, the Attorney General from the state of California currently? The former Attorney General from the state of California is now a United States Senator. We found her totally oblivious to the case, not interested, not even like the judges available to have read or discussed the matter. So if we don't move with the Inter-American Commission, and I have to tell you, the percentage of cases they take is very small. Probably around 10% of all petitions that go to them get taken to them. So any help anyone can give in terms of encouraging them to take this case, we of course appreciate. But that's really what we're looking for. Otherwise, I'm afraid we're at the end of the road. Unless I figure out a way of doing what I did with the King family, we had a civil trial against known conspirators. We had a civil trial. And that civil trial allowed for all the evidence on the assassination of Martin to be brought forward. There were 70 witnesses over 30 days, 1999. Took the jury 59 minutes after hearing all of the evidence to very clearly dismiss any possibility that James Earl Ray was guilty, and to find liability largely on behalf of the government of the United States, its agents, state of Tennessee, its agents, city of Memphis, its agents, in the assassination of Martin King. Now that came as a result of that civil trial that I brought for the King family. It's conceivable we could bring a similar civil action at some point in time on behalf of Mr. Sirhan. The problem with all of these efforts is they're enormously expensive. Once you get into court and you start suing people and you go into depositions, you're well into six figures before you know when it's hit you. So it's very costly. And we don't have any financial support for this work. Nobody is willing to support it. So that's a barrier to bringing the civil action. But so we're there with this, and we will wait and see what the commission has to say, and we'll try to take it forward and try to develop all of the evidence, both ballistics, both mind control, all sound evidence, all the evidence that we have. We hope to be in a position where we can put it forward. That's all we can do. I want to thank you for coming, and thank you for hearing about this, because you won't hear about it in mainstream media as a rule, although I don't know, maybe the Washington Times, who's here, will print something. But for the most part, the books do not get reviewed, and the issues do not get reviewed. And if you have a question about why that is, because a long time ago that puzzled me too. Why is it? These are solid stories, researched over many years. You have facts obtained under oath and depositions, sworn statements by people. Why, with this extraordinary kind of content, why don't the media use it? You know, Hoover's dead, who was the prime mover in the killing of King. Dulles is dead, who was one of the prime movers in the killing of both John and Montague and Robert Kennedy. So the individuals are gone. So we said, well, why would they protect these individuals? They're protecting the agencies, the funding, the credibility of government, and the posture of these types of issues to the public of the United States of America. Once the public starts to lose confidence, in its government and its agencies, then it's a sad day for a lot of these people who have picked up the tools and are running the agencies today. So they have to keep this under wraps as much as possible, and they have to rely upon the fact that there will not be this historical record printed that anyone will pick up and look at. I've had a few media people who over the years, remember this has been a 40-year saga, who have tried to do something about it, and they have suffered greatly as a result of that. And it's a deterrent. People have mortgages, families, tuition bills to pay, jobs to keep. And in this marketplace today, personal lives and personal interests often come forward. So this work relies on the interests of a committed and valiant few who may be willing to go forward with it. We will see. And we'll just see what happens with this next chapter. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you. We'll have time for questions. I'll just start things off. But a particularly dramatic situation was at the parole hearing a year ago, the final California parole hearing. They can't have another one for 4 years. When Paul Schrade, who was another close friend of Robert Kennedy, and who was hit in the forehead by a bullet from Sirhan,
One of the two shots glanced off Paul's head. Yeah.
Yes, and he begged the Parole Commission to do something about this. Maybe if you could talk just briefly, and then
Sure.
we'll get to questions about the impact of that.
Paul has come over the years looking and desperately trying to find out the truth about what happened to his friend. He's working for the UAW, was a coordinator for Robert Kennedy. And he has come to the conclusion that Sirhan is innocent, and he was given an unfair trial. And so he went to the parole hearing, and he said, yes, I was hit, but he was knocked out. He was unconscious, so he didn't remember all the stuff that was going on afterward. But he said, I have examined this case. I've actually listened to this man, Sirhan, his counsel. We have talked a great deal about it. And he pleaded with the parole board not to just deny this parole once again for the usual reasons. Oh, he's going to be a menace to society if he's released, this 74-year-old guy who would end up going to Jordan anyway, not even be in America. All these phony reasons. They just can't admit anything. They have to keep him in jail. James O'Reilly died in prison, of course, 1998. And if we're not successful here, Sirhan will die in prison. He's not the healthiest man in the world. He's 74 years old. So it's not too good. So Paul, as Andrew said, made this impassioned plea, and when he was totally ignored, and he had the right as a victim to speak, he became very angry with this parole board, and really vituperatively so. And to this day, he's still trying to figure and help in any way he can to try to get a hearing for Sirhan.
Well, let's get to questions, but I also want to say that this parole hearing was in effect closed to the public except for a pool report. And so we know very little about all of this stuff. And for some reason, in an open society, this case has to be kept quiet for some reason. But let's get to questions. Yes, sir, in the back.
Yes. Thank you. My name is Jaffer with Al-Mayadeen TV. I'd like you, if you could address the Kennedy family version, in the sense that in the public domain, a few years ago up until now, there's been considerable evidence to suggest that at least there was some questionable issues with the official version. Now, if the public is aware of that, logic tends to say, well, the Kennedy family has access to considerable amount of official documentation and their version, yet they maintain their official or supported the official version of the government. Why is that?
Well, that's only partially true. I mean, Ethel Kennedy does not want to deal with this case at all, and this has been an enormous amount of stress for her, so she does not want to be involved. So the Kennedy family's representation on the issues related to this case really has fallen to Bobby Jr. And Bobby Jr. is on the side that we're talking about of wanting to see an evidentiary hearing for Sirhan. He has been moving along, because he's very close to Paul Schrade. He's been moving along in this direction now for quite some period of time. And I think it's only a matter of time before Bobby himself, and remember it's a very large family clan, that Bobby himself comes out and supports this type of process. There's an important element to keep in mind that we are generally not aware of in this kind of case. You have to remember that the Kennedy family's lost 3 brothers, and the only one left was Teddy. And Teddy took a very different position than Bobby and John with respect to a lot of progressive issues in politics, and certainly questions of the assassination. He came to believe that the lives of the other family members, including John Kennedy's son, John, were going to be endangered if they went down the road of trying to get at the truth, because he knows what happened to Bobby and this was a goal that Bobby had. Bobby was going to reopen the investigation of his brother. Now, I know that because I told you about a meeting I had with Bill Atwood. Well, the week after I met with Atwood, Jim Garrison came up from New Orleans and met with Atwood. And as I spent 5 hours with Atwood, Garrison, I believe, spent over 7 with him. And that night, Bill called Bobby Kennedy at 1 o'clock in the morning. And he said, the district attorney from New Orleans has just shaken me in my shoes. He's convinced me that the CIA killed your brother. And Bobby's response was, yes, we know. But I have to get the White House in order to reopen this whole matter. Bill Atwood, that was 1 a.m. 4 a.m., Bill Atwood had a heart attack. And he left Look magazine, except as a roving reporter. And he never, my piece on Ramparts was not published, and Garrison's work on JFK was not published. Chandler Broussard, who was the deputy editor working on both of these, was fired, and so that ended that. So I think there is this concern on these families that they will be visited if they decide to get into this frame. I called Bill Atwood's widow after he passed away, and just out of respect, and she said, Bill had a high regard for everything you've done and are doing, but please do me a favor and don't involve me in anything that you're doing with respect to his former work, because I have children to raise in this country. And I've respected that, and I've done that. I also know that from the King family standpoint, Marty King, Martin's oldest son, has been really very, very apprehensive about what could happen if he started to try to promulgate the truth about his father's death. I had him sit in on a deposition with a man called Len Curtis, who identified the shooter. And I had lunch with the shooter. And I had Marty sit in on the deposition with Lenny Curtis, and I gave him a video and a sworn copy of it. And he was to share that and discuss it with the family, and best of my knowledge, it never quite got there. And he was terrified because Dexter, his brother, when he came out in support of a trial for James Earl Ray, received enormous harassment. And so he thought, this was next for him. So these are complicated matters for families who, on the one hand, have to get on with life in this country, put all of this behind them, and yet there's this lingering desire to seek justice. And others have to do most of the work and hope that they will come on board. But if they don't, they don't. It took the King family a number of years before they decided to join with me, and which they did. And then when Coretta died, we lost the main pillar of the search for truth. And the children there was disruption, they had various problems, and so it didn't. So, I mean, that's the best answer I can give you, not, being aware of the internal dynamics to the extent that I am, that's the best answer I can give you.
The sort of the investigation of the blackout that Sirhan experienced, didn't remember the shooting. And you said the woman with the polka dot dress. I don't think she's ever been identified, has she?
No.
Never been identified?
No.
And the
I have leads to her. She is still alive as well, but she's never been positively confirmed identified.
you think you know who she is?
I believe so.
And how about the person at the racetrack who brought him to the clinic? Is he known?
He's known under two names. He disappeared.
What names was he known under?
Well, they were Frank Donamaruta was the main. It's an Italian name, and then the other alias I'm not sure of that, but I have it. But it's Donamaruta was the main name. He was a mafia guy.
Did you ever believe this had anything to do with the CIA's Ultra program, that all the experimentation done in the CIA with drugs and other forms of...
There's no question about it. There's no question about it. They had been at that for a very long period of time. In much more sophisticated ways, the agency is capable of not only controlling minds, but actually instilling disease, causing disease into people. And I think we saw the first indications of that with Jack Ruby as long ago.
Are you aware of the recent research that's been done on the this Oswald Innocence campaign to do a detailed analysis of the Ruby shooting of Oswald and identify that it wasn't Ruby that did the shooting? The stand-in, very convincing evidence. It's just newly come out.
That's interesting. I'm not familiar with that. 'Cause
Yeah.
I stayed.
And one more point on that. Ruby always confessed that he didn't remember shooting,
Yeah.
which has come out again, another blackout period. He remembers coming down into the driveway and he remembers everybody piling on him, but he never remembered shooting.
The actual shooting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have stayed for the most part away from any detailed work on the John Kennedy assassination for the reasons, fairly obvious reasons, that when someone gets involved in all of these cases, one becomes clearly labeled and maligned as some kind of conspiracy nut. And I had personal interest in...
Involvement with one of them will get you that time.
Yeah, sure it will, but I had personal interest in two of them, so those are the ones that I focused
But I
on.
invite you to look at it because there are similarities with Sirhan.
That's interesting,
coming out
yeah.
right now.
Okay.
Alan, Dr. Pepper, thank you for your persistence and your indefatigable effort to seek something on our behalf so that those of us who are old enough to remember 1968 might ultimately have a better, deeper understanding of what took place. Without spending too much time on the subject of Thane Eugene Caesar or Dan Moldea, I know that you're aware that Mr. Moldea succeeded in persuading, after a number of years, succeeded in persuading Thane Eugene Caesar to participate in a polygraph examination. His response to the question, if I recall it correctly, and it's possible I don't, the question was, did you shoot Robert Kennedy deliberately or accidentally? To which Mr. Caesar responded by saying no, emphatically. According to the polygraph operator, he passed the test. I think I understand, and it's always possible I don't, that Mr. Moldea became Thane Eugene Caesar's daughter's godfather. That Mr. Moldea may have moved to the Philippines, or I mean, Mr. Caesar may have moved to the Philippines or someplace like that. Other people, one researcher in particular, has focused on someone else who may have been thought to have had a proper place within Robert Kennedy's entourage during the California campaign. I'm curious where you are on any of these areas. Sorry.
That's all right. Dan Moldea changed his position rather dramatically on this case, and I understand, and in fact, Jimmy Lazar, I think Moldea may have admitted this to Jimmy at one point, that he would never be published again if he didn't change his position. And so Moldea seems to have changed his position, number one. Number two, I don't believe Thane Cesar Caesar killed Robert Kennedy. I think every indication about him is that he has been a racist and all of that. Did not like the Kennedys, but I don't believe that he killed him. Bob Kennedy was killed by a real pro who has a long history of that success, and very close to one of the senior members of the CIA. So in terms of Moldea, I don't think he was honest, and in terms of Thane Cesar Caesar, I don't believe he was the shooter.
Thank you.
Sir, how do you have an idea who it was that actually fired the shots from behind? It seems there must have been witnesses, people close to Robert Kennedy. There'd be people would know who got that close. Could you say who it was?
No, I can't say who it was because I have a track and a good deal of information to this person, but I'm nowhere near able to do that or be willing to identify him. In terms of witnesses who were there at the time, this was the purpose of having Sirhan. When he fired first those two shots, the whole room was totally distracted and everybody was fixed on him. And that's really what they had in mind. That's really what they had in mind. Yeah.
Let's go to Mike.
Dr. Pepper, I'm Mike Springman, attorney, author, and former diplomat. I have two quick questions. You had mentioned the media is fully under control, and do you mean by the establishment, by the government, or by both? And secondly, I missed the name of the guy who was doing the examination of Sirhan Sirhan, saying he'd been under mind control.
Right. The psychologist is Harvard psychologist Dr. Daniel Brown. And his lengthy report is contained in this petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Right. Okay. So that's Brown. I'm sorry. What was your other question?
When you said the established media was under control,
Yeah.
was this the establishment of government or both?
Well, no. Government agencies and government agents are foot soldiers for the forces who rule this country. And we better understand that that's how it works. FBI agents, CIA agents really are foot soldiers, and they have their positions and they carry out their tasks, often in a very straightforward, decent, professional way. But when it comes to some matters, like these ones which we are discussing, they follow the masters. Now, how do you know that? Who are the bankers who benefit from the oil and energy crises and the bail-in legislation that comes through? Who are the bankers who do that? You know, I became close friends with Madeline Brown. You know who Madeline Brown is? All right. She was Lyndon Johnson's mistress. She gave Lyndon Johnson his only son. Died when he was around 40. And she was in love with Lyndon Johnson. And she would go to various events and affairs with Lyndon. And she was at Clint Murchison's house on the 21st of November, 1963. It was a party there that Murchison hosted for J. Edgar Hoover, Richard Nixon, H.L. Hunt, a number of other oil men, the mayor of Dallas. They were all gathered there in that party. Lyndon came in about 10 o'clock that night. They all went into Clint's study, came out about 20 minutes later. He goes up behind Madeline, puts his arms around her and says, "After tomorrow, the son of a bitch in Kennedy's will never embarrass me again." Next morning, he calls her from Fort Worth. He says, "I'm going to hear the son of a bitch deliver his last speech." All right? Madeline told me, I pushed her to write. She did a book eventually called Texas in the Morning, which she sets this out. And I never could understand why she loved this guy, but nevertheless she did. And so it's very clear, it was very clear that was a very critical meeting. Now, who else was at that meeting? It puzzled me for years. John J. McCloy. How many know who John J. McCloy is? He is one of the key, more senior agents and representatives of the ruling forces. He was, at that time, chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. And I kept saying, what is Chase Manhattan Bank? Why would David Rockefeller allow his number one man, who had been also Governor General of Germany and he ran the main prison, released all of the Nazis to go to South America. So why would this guy be at this kind of meeting and getting this kind of information? And I couldn't understand it because I happened to be friendly with the Rockefeller family, from my sins in a sense, because Nelson tried to get me to run for office for years, so I came in to become friendly. I never run for office. Become friendly with the family, with his daughter, Nelson's daughter, Annie, and David's daughter, Abby. And Abby and I still to this day are friends. I asked Abby to set up a meeting with her father before my daughter, before he died. And she pleaded, no, he's trying to reconcile with the children, and don't ask me to do that. So I said, forget about it. I didn't. But I mean, if I had confronted him, he would, of course, he would deny any involvement in the assassination, but in my view, he had to sign off. McCloy's presence meant Eastern, powerful, banking interest signed off on the killing of Jack Kennedy. Now, why? He's going to remove the oil depletion allowance from the oil companies. It cost them billions of dollars. He's going to end the war in Vietnam. Cost the oil and energy and military establishment billions of dollars. Jack Kennedy was becoming intolerable. And someone last night pointed out that maybe he said he was going to look at the 1913 Federal Reserve Act and figure, because that was the key to the control of finance in the country.
He published, as you recall, he published a series of bills that were backed by gold again. He published that were directly backed by the government. One series he published, it has a red seal on it, it's very well known. A couple of things.
So let me just finish this. So I think it eventually, me being a bit thick, it eventually became clear that these were major forces that were determined to get rid of John Kennedy.
Jerry, before we get to you, Brian, back, just two quick footnotes. John McCloy was on the Warren Commission.
Yeah.
So he's one of the 7 commissioners adjudicating all of this.
And he also published a letter, it's in the Holocaust Museum,
Yeah.
where, and when the position he had in World War II, he prohibited the bombing of the rail lines going into Auschwitz.
Yes.
And two more very quick things.
Well, yeah.
He was also, in the 1950s, head of the Ford Foundation, one of the major foundations in this country, and in a establishment biography of that, page 493, as I recall, it describes, by J.K. Bird, it describes the Ford Foundation as the #1 pass-through for CIA money to launder it for worthy purposes. The other very quick thing is Madeline Brown, while she's passed away now, is described for blunt purposes as a mistress. She was also a somewhat prominent person in public relations.
Yes, she was.
And
Yes.
so she was regarded as a professional woman, not,
Yes.
quote, mistress. So what we're talking about is this is a description of cutting through the public veneer of these people and institutions.
I'll just, one further caveat to your first question. In the course of my work, I identified the military man who was a colonel and a CIA agent who was responsible for putting the SWAT team, choosing the SWAT team and putting them into Memphis as a backup unit in case a civilian shooter didn't get Dr. King. His name was John Downey, Colonel John Downey. John Downey was Lyndon Johnson's briefer on Vietnam. In fact, at one point, I think he said he thought he knew me in Vietnam. I don't believe that's the case. But in any event, he would come back and brief the president on the war in Vietnam. And he kept saying to the president, what are we doing here? Why are we here, Mr. President? Why are we losing blood and treasure in this kind of horrific war? What is this all about? Why can't we get out of here? Why do we? And Johnson ignored him for the most part. And then finally, one day, the president, I guess, thought he'd had enough, or he was irascible. He pounded the table and he said, "John, I can't get out of Vietnam. My friends are making too much money." Now, so that you get glimpses of these forces, like H.L. Hunt at the time, but across the country, and their bankers, who, if they can compromise you, if they can buy you off, if they can give you another job, if they can promote you, if they can do anything else but kill you, they will do that. Or they will blacklist you if you're too much of a nuisance, like Pete Seeger was for a number of years. They blacklist you, you don't have an audience. They'll do all of that. But at the end of the day, if they can't do anything else, and you're too dangerous, that's when the politics of assassination come in. But it's throughout history. I'm working on a book now that goes back to the Sumerians, down to the present time. And it's throughout history, political assassinations have been the ultimate task when someone is intolerable. And you can see it in British history. We see it all the way down. Now, the person who gave me this information about Downey, just so you know it's cited, was his daughter. And I got her finally to talk to me, and she told me this, and she said when he heard this from Johnson that afternoon, he came home. He said to his wife, "Pack your bags, we're going, I'm having myself assigned to Canada, to the embassy in Canada." He said, "I'm not going to have anything more to do with this." And he, you know, in many ways, I have to respect this guy, and I look on him as a patriot on the one hand. On the other hand, he then came back the following June, and he headed up the unit that was responsible for backing up the killing of King. So he had the balance. And is that where the racism comes in? Possibly, right? Possibly. He was from Pennsylvania, rural Pennsylvania, possibly. Also, he without doubt believed he was doing the right thing, as would David Rockefeller. If I you know, rather than being at some cookout with him up in Mechanico, as if I had a serious talk with him and said, you know, about this, he would defend it. If he had to, if he was really nailed, he'd defend it as being the best interest of the perpetuation of democracy in this republic. And he'd do it unashamedly, I'm sure.
Jerry?
In terms of the shooting of Robert Kennedy, were you aware of the Elkins family, which was the primary witnesses in the McClellan hearings, ran the mobs in the West, had warned Bobby Kennedy in Portland, Oregon, just before the California primary, to fire his bodyguards. Did you ever come across that? I had that firsthand.
He said what?
Ray Elkins, one of the family,
Yeah, but,
flew to Portland
yeah,
and told Bobby to fire his bodyguards.
yeah. It wasn't his bodyguard, it was his advance man, but that's a whole other story, because he had the same advance man that John had,
Bill Berry? No?
Jerry Bruno.
Oh, Jerry Bruno, right.
Yeah. Okay.
Briefly, to piggyback on this gentleman's question, you've already answered what I've thought, that you might have thought that Thane Eugene Caesar was the shooter. You don't believe that?
No.
So do you look with disfavor on Teddy Chirac's spell in the second gun, which tends to point the finger at Thane Eugene Caesar?
Well, I think Chirac did a lot of good work, and I think pretty clearly there was a second gun. I think he's wrong with respect to pointing the finger at Caesar, yes.
And last, all the evidence that was destroyed by the Los
Yeah.
Angeles Police Department, I mean, the tremendous amount of evidence
Yeah.
was destroyed. Has there
Never been raised, it was never raised in the trial. They got rid of the ceiling tiles, rid of the door frames, never raised by defense counsel. Why?
evidence that was clearly indicated,
Yeah.
you know,
Didn't
never
Daryl Gates,
ballistics, never examined.
Yeah, that's
Daryl
right.
Gates say they didn't have enough space to hold?
Oh, yeah, that was the,
And I think there's a clear connection with him and the CIA, if I'm not mistaken.
Were there any duplicate copies of any of that evidence?
no.
So it was entirely.
Not so far as we know, no. They just destroyed it. That's the destruction of evidence was, you know, Article 18 of the Declaration of Human Rights and Responsibilities of Man Article 18 is the one we're gone in under that deals with the unfair trial, a right to a fair trial. And that's the one that we've gone in on. And when you put the list of all those things, like you just mentioned, Jerry, the destruction of the ceiling tiles, door frames, all this evidence that had bullet holes in them.
And probably ballistics that could have been captured
Yes.
from the weapon,
Yes.
from the shells that were there.
Yes.
I'm curious to know if you may ever have touched upon any indication at all inside the inside the Los Angeles Police Department or inside Dr. Noguchi's office, which might offer some explanation as to the source of post-mortem photographs of Robert Kennedy that were found inside James Angleton's safe when the safe was opened after Angleton was removed from his position as chief of counterintelligence.
Yeah. I've not looked that hard at people inside Noguchi's office. I just have enormous admiration for Dr. Noguchi and his work and what he tried to do, and his position today, as you know, is on our side. But and my only knowledge of the Los Angeles Police Department is the long-standing relationship that they have had with the CIA, a long-standing relationship. And when the drugs were brought in, you know, and Bill Clinton made, as governor of Arkansas, made a deal with Bush, and they met, and they allowed the drugs to be brought into Mena Airport and given to the 5 gangs for cities. One of the cities, money for the CIA and their operations, one of the cities was Los Angeles. So I think LA has had that reputation, but I have not. And 2 of the investigating officers were CIA operatives in South America. So they've had that tie, and I think that's all I could say about that. Martin King was to have been killed in Los Angeles, not Memphis. And that's something that people don't understand. James Earl Ray was put in Los Angeles for weeks. And the military, we interviewed, or a colleague interviewed for me because they wouldn't talk to me, I was Ray's lawyer, 2 of the shooters who fled to Mexico. The shooter and spotter fled to Mexico after the killing because they thought there was going to be a cleanup. And they said they were kept in Los Angeles, and they were told that the shooting, the assassination, was to be in Los Angeles. And then all of a sudden, they get pulled out of Los Angeles and sent to the south, and then into Memphis. I've been working with Frank Holloman, who was a former aide. He was chief of police and fire in Memphis, but former aide to J. Edgar Hoover. So they were all shipped there, and James Earl Ray was told to go there. And that was a puzzle. They didn't know why. And then I realized, of course, belatedly, that Los Angeles had been picked as the site of for the assassination of Bob Kennedy. And you couldn't have 2 assassinations, figures like King and Kennedy in the same city within 2 months. That would be too much. So they had to go elsewhere. They chose Memphis for Martin. And Bob still was to be hit in Los Angeles.
Two questions. One, cleanup. I assume you mean that those involved were worried about themselves being eliminated.
Yes.
My more substantive question is this Inter-American Organization of American States process. How much do you know and can share about how that process works? Are there opportunities for interim additional filings? By the way, I've looked into it. The new chairman, as of last month, is from Peru. There's an American on it. He's a Stanford law professor who was chairman until June. His term expires in December. It's a 5-person commission. Is there any points of formal or informal pressure that the public can add, or is it just all in the document in a black box?
Well, I think, yes. The answer to your question is yes. Anyone who has the desire can contact the Inter-American Commission and can say, we seriously hope you will take a look at this case. It's significant, and we hope that you will. The good thing about it is the American influence has been greatly diminished in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the court, greatly diminished. The Stanford professor is not likely to be reappointed, but there is no other American involved, and there is great disdain for America throughout the hemisphere. Great disdain for America.
Before I get to your question, I'll just add that I invited the Inter-American Commission to this press conference. All of this stuff that we're talking about is documented, it's open, there's a desire to test the evidence, I think. And I'll just add that there's a number of co-sponsoring groups for this press conference, several of which I'm affiliated with, but Swedish Doctors for Human Rights has endorsed this. The Indicter magazine in Europe, I'm on their editorial board, has published about this press conference. The Fifth Estate, run by a former editor of the Jakarta Post, has written a big thing about this news conference yesterday. And also Dr. Cyril Wecht, who was he was a consultant to Dr. Noguchi, has issued a very strong factual, scientific-based report endorsing what you're doing with, like many of these, they don't get into why or how, they just talk about the scientific, medical impossibility of Sirhan firing the fatal shot. And it's really up to more people in the public to get into the whys, whos, and wherefore of what really happened. Brian?
Yeah, just one would you be able to circulate those
Yes,
information?
they're all on the website of the Justice Integrity Project, an organization I edit. Its website is justice-integrity.org, and there's quite extensive materials on this. And in fact, we're going to be able to put a film of this news conference on. Also, I'll mention that Dr. Cyril Wecht is chairman of a group called Citizens Against Political Assassinations, plural, around the world. And let me just mention again before getting to the next question here, that political assassinations, that sounds like some terrific conspiracy, weird thing. We can't have anything to do with that. We can't cover anything that they possibly might do. But when you think about it, as Dr. Pepper says, political assassinations go back to antiquity.
Oh, yeah.
And I've heard him talk all the way up to the current times. But even the official version of Lee Harvey Oswald, James Earl Ray, Sirhan, those would be political assassinations according to the mainstream view. So an organization that opposes political assassinations is not even necessarily taking a position. They're just saying we shouldn't be shooting people like Reverend King or President Kennedy. So it should be, you would think, logically something that the news media might cover, at any rate.
Again, Bill, you had mentioned that we would have access to, I assume that the depositions in the binder?
Well, there's a whole range of documents in there. The main document is the application to the Inter-American Commission, and then there's a full petition that contains all of the evidence and so forth. And then there are appendices, things like Dan Brown's report and the Brzezinski report and the on the weapons. So yes, there's everything in there. We have to figure a way, and I will work on this with Andrew. We have to figure a way to get it out. It's too large to go into an email, and sometimes the links work, sometimes they don't. But you got a Dropbox possibility. Yeah,
We'll get that. We have
we'll work
time
it
for
out.
one quick question. Actually, we've got to close down, so please make it very quick. One more.
Very quick. In your opinion, is there any truth or any evidence to support Mr. Trump's allegation that Ted Cruz's father, Raul, was actually involved in JFK's.
I have no information about that at all.
There is, but we didn't.
I understand that CIA's David Sanchez Morales may have boasted of being part of the assassination of RFK as well as JFK. Can you comment on that?
Well, there's some dispute. There appears to be photographs that show him being present at the ambassador at the time of the assassination. I think there were a lot of people present at the assassination. There were a lot of backups. Sorry?
Have you concluded it was Morales in those photographs or not?
It looks like him. I don't know that it.
Moving pictures too, yeah.
Yeah, it looked like him.
David Talbot and Moore, they researched that, checked it out, and they said it wasn't after all. They did it in depth. David Talbot and Moore, they wrote about that.
Yeah.
Well, they said it was not?
No, they did extensive research on it, and they said, the similarity, but they determined it wasn't after all. That doesn't mean to say that Morales wasn't involved.
Yeah.
It's just not. I was gonna.
Well, Morales was definitely not the shooter. He was
No,
not.
no.
No.
I was going to say just one quick question. In Lamar Walden's book, he points out that David Morales had a plot to kill Castro involving a kitchen pantry. When I read that, it was very eerily similar to what happened to RFK. So I don't know. That was interesting.
Okay.
Last final thing, and we've got to close down, I'm afraid, but first, thank you all for being here. And the final thought, and particularly for anyone who has anything to do with young people or others around the world interested in this, is I think you can see here that only a few people can actually make a difference in something like this. So, there are many draws on our attention, but just a few people, and I would point to Dr. Pepper. Think of what he was doing in his 20s, in the 1960s, going to Vietnam, getting involved with Dr. King and Robert Kennedy. This is all more than 50 years ago when he was a young man, and lots of young people are looking for things to do, or at least they might like to know that they can make a difference. And again, history has a link to current events, in my view, and I think all of this demonstrates that. So thank you all for coming, and I, at the Justice Integrity Project, can provide documents to any who are interested in the follow-ups on this.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.